that, though, I was invited to set up meetings with my congressional representatives here in the state of Oregon, which I was able to do. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We call that the lobbying effort and the campaign for disclosure. So on May 8th, 2001, my friend Abigail Lewis, our friend Antonio Pinto, and myself arrived in Washington, D.C. The night before, May 8th, there was a rehearsal that happened. I would like Daniel Sheehan to speak about what that was about, to prepare the witnesses about what they were to say the next morning here at this press conference. Then it was the three different things that happened on May 9th specifically, beginning with the press conference, what we did in the afternoon that day, taking some of these witnesses around to congressional offices to give testimony about the energy technologies. We were advised to characterize it that way rather than UFO phenomenon, which I agree was a good strategy. Then what happened the week after May 9th, and several of the witnesses, myself, Dan Willis, Abigail Lewis, and several others stayed around to do very grassroots, literally walking the halls of Congress for several days, knocking on doors to distribute the all the information we had. I'm so glad I was able to find in my storage spaces all this paper that we dumped all over the congressional people. I mean, it was reams and reams and reams of paper and VHS tapes and the books and just that part, the logistics of distributing all that material that involved pallet dollies, literally. Me talking my way into one of the congressional copy offices when we ran out of paper. The machine broke. I had to call somebody over to fix it and put more staples in it, which felt like a fun, exciting challenge in just itself. So I'm going to just run through. There's about 35 slides here. I'm not going to take too much time, but I just really want to honor and celebrate the witnesses, of course, but also a lot of the staff and volunteers. This was a total grassroots effort. And so some of these pictures give homage and pay respect to the people that volunteered and just gave up so much in their lives to pull this off. So, okay, Ron, go ahead and run it. So the next slide, please. So you've seen pictures like this. These are out of my own literal throwaway camera at the time. So glad I was able to find some of these pictures. I didn't find all of them, but here's the ones I was able to get. So next slide. Next slide. Everybody's seen these pictures, so I'm not going to name all the witnesses that are up on that panel. Okay, hold on that slide for a minute, please. Get my laser pointer. So this, of course, is Dan Willis, our friend Antonio Pinto, who was very involved in building the original Disclosure Project website with Abigail Lewis, who's here in the center. Daniel Sheehan, of course. Here's me almost 20 years ago exactly to the day. This is a man named Bob Brown, who a lot of people will know, the organizer of the International UFO Congress that has been such a big part of all these events over the years. And a man named Jaime Maussan, who some people might recognize, a journalist in Mexico. Next slide. There's Stephen Bassett 20 years ago, looking pretty handsome there with Abby. Next slide. Here are some of the volunteers that I really want to pay respects to. So Debbie Foch has been with Stephen Greer in the Disclosure Project long before I was involved. So that's Debbie Foch. She lives New England somewhere. Myself, and this is a man named Ricky Butterfass, who's been extraordinarily dedicated to Disclosure Project before, during, and ever since my involvement in 2001 and 2002. Next slide. Another woman that's certainly due her credit. This woman is just, Linda Willits has just put an incredible amount of work to all of Steve Greer's endeavors. So she's looking good here with Stephen. This is one of the witnesses that was with us during some of the lobbying campaigns that we did. A man named Don Phillips, worked for the Lockheed Skunk Works, among other things, CAA contractor. Next slide, please. This is a fun picture. There's Dan. This is a dear friend and woman, Donna Hare, who is one of the few female witnesses on the panel there that day. Antonio again and myself. Next slide. These aren't very good pictures, unfortunately, but I just had to get the one picture I could find. This is literally halls of Congress here. This is a man named Don Daniels, who was very active in the lobbying campaign. I think that's Ricky Butterfass again. A man named John Cipher, who introduced Greer during many of the lectures that we went on to do during the campaign for disclosure tour. There's the backside of Antonio Pinto, and that's me, I think. Next slide. Again, Jaime Maussan. Abby, this is Jaime's assistant at the time. I don't recall that man's name. Next slide.
Yes.
There's Regina back in the day. Next slide, please. Again, Danny Sheehan and myself. This was probably that evening before the May 8th that, boy, talk about untold histories. I hope Danny can talk about what happened on May 8th, the night before the press conference, and especially the closed door briefing session that happened the evening of May 9th. I'm pretty sure Daniel was involved in that, and he can speak to that later today. Next slide. There's me. This was taken in Los Angeles, so I didn't actually speak very well to the idea that there was this whole speaking tour that occurred for about a year after the press conference. And I just have some of the cities here that I was able to find: San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Miami, Seattle, Vancouver, British Columbia, Washington, D.C. again, Charlottesville, Virginia, Boston, Massachusetts, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, Asheville. Some of these didn't actually happen. Phoenix did, Dallas did. Anyway, so there was 25 speaking engagements that I was present at and helped facilitate all the logistics. So that is basically event producer, event coordinator was my role with the Disclosure Project after the May 9th press conference. Next slide, please. So I think the rest of these middle group of slides are just some of the volunteers and some of the work that we did on the ground. I was so glad I was able to find some of these photos. Next slide. Steve Bassett just referred to the VHS tapes. There's my hand on all the VHS tapes that we distributed. Some of them, of course, we sold at the events, but a lot of those were hand delivered by myself, Abby Lewis, Antonio Pinto, and others during the week following May 9th to the congressional people. Next slide. Next slide. Some of our volunteers. I think this is also the Los Angeles event. Next slide. Here's Stephen speaking to the crowd. I guess part of what I wanted to emphasize, you can go next slide, is the response that we got. Ron, earlier in preparing for these presentations today, was asking me, he was asking the response that we got on 3 different levels. How did the journalists react on May 9th there at the press conference? How did the congressional people respond to our lobbying campaigns? And then how did the general public respond? And I just wanted to give a couple of slides here. You can go ahead and do next, Ron. Sorry, this is a man named Kevin Kachiki, and we called him Kevy K. This man did an enormous amount of work and came to a lot of the events to help on the ground. Not paid a dime, happy to do it. Love this man. Kevy, I hope you're out there, brother. Good work. Next slide. This young woman right here is one of Steve Greer's 4 daughters and her best friend that was helping us facilitate. I think the very first one that we did, this would be the second one of the speaking tour. This is Emily Greer, Stephen's wife, who did a tremendous amount of work shipping so many of that materials right out of her kitchen. She was the order fulfillment department for, I don't know, a good year for the Disclosure Project, literally cottage industry right out of her kitchen. Next slide. Oh, here's just some pictures of the crowd and the various events that we did. Next slide. This was Portland. Next slide. That's Stephen in the front row there. This is Portland also. Oh, yes. Dee Dee Farrell, just another one of these unsung heroes who did so much work. This is my dear, dear friend, Joel Garvin, who's gone on to do tremendous work with the energy technologies and other things like that. Still been involved with Stephen, and he's a scientist that understands a lot about the energy technologies. Next slide. I think this was also Portland. Next slide. This was a whole adventure in itself. So again, showing all the materials that we distributed. I had another slide that shows us loading and unloading all the materials in and out of the back of my truck. So much of my involvement in the Disclosure Project tour was being the mobile warehouse, literally driving all this material in the back of my truck to all the different lectures that we did. I'm sure people in the audience will know J.Z. Knight and the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. We were invited to do a private thing there that wasn't on the speaking schedule. That was extraordinary, just that. Next slide, I think I have a few more of those pictures. Yeah, so here we are at the Ramtha School in Yelm, Washington. There was, I don't know, close to 1,000 people in that audience. Steve spoke for 6 hours, I think. The reception there was tremendous. So many standing ovations. This is just one of them. It was an extraordinary experience among tremendous, extraordinary experiences. Next slide. I think I got one more of Ramtha there. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so this next group of slides, and then we're going to wrap it up, is what we call, well, the whole speaking tour was really called the Campaign for Disclosure. So much of that was encouraging ordinary people, ordinary citizens to come to these events. Hear Dr. Greer speak about the project. Most of the events that we did around the country had some of the local people that we could fly in or drive in, the witnesses and things to accompany Steve Greer speaking at these locals, like a book tour kind of thing, speaking tour. But so much of that was, let's engage the congressional people. Dan Willis and Abby Lewis will speak to this in a moment in more detail about what we were able to pull off there. Just seeing if there's anybody else I want to recognize. I don't remember these people's names, unfortunately, but there was just so many great people that just were so happy to get involved. It was so exciting. Next slide, please. There's Oh, can you go back one? I just wanted to point Abby out doing her work. There's Abby, probably with no sleep. I think this must have been Berkeley, California, or San Francisco, I'm going to guess. Again, all these VHS tapes, there was hundreds and hundreds of them that we that sold right there at the events, but so much of that material, again, was delivered for free, of course, to all the congressional people. Next slide, please. And yeah, here's the letters that we would mail. So we paid the postage somehow even. I'm not quite sure how that was achieved in terms of finances, but somehow we would encourage people to write the letters to their congresspeople. You saw some of the tables that we had set up for people to do that after the lectures. Then we would literally take them to the post office and mail them to the particular representatives based on where people were living. Next slide. I only knew this woman as Raven. I have since learned her real name, but at the time I only knew her as Raven, did a tremendous amount of work, like I said, with Kevin Kachikian. I wish I knew her last name so I could properly honor her here, but I have an idea she might be watching. So Raven, thank you for all that tremendous work you did. It was amazing. Next slide. Here, people are grabbing their letters to their congresspeople that we're, of course, distributing for free, writing out their letters, and then we put them in the envelopes and mail them. Go ahead, next slide, please. Get another picture of the stations we'd set up for people to be able to do that. Next slide. More people writing their letters. Next slide. So there's me, very excitedly, probably the next morning, mailing a big stack of letters off to Washington, D.C. Next slide. Okay, so that kind of concludes my slideshow. I have a few more after this one, but boy, September 11th, 2001 was a huge day for the whole world, obviously. It's uncertain exactly why things didn't quite come off the way that we had all planned and been excited for, but certainly the events of September 11th, 2001 put a major damper on the efforts that we were getting some traction on. We happened to be doing a private meeting that night, Steve Greer and myself, in Everett, Washington is where that was. This happens to be a group of psychiatrists, psychologists had a monthly, like a book club kind of thing, a invited speaker every month. Stephen Greer happened to be the one that was scheduled for that fateful day, September 11th. So about 100 people came that night, and the energy in that room was particularly odd given the events of that day. We did do some more speaking events after this one, continuing the tour that was already planned, but it really started to wind down, of course, on September 11th. So when I say this whole thing changed my life, I was a graduate student in college just a few months before May 9th, 2001. And I put a lot of energy into moving myself here to Ashland, Oregon, and getting involved in school and all that, thinking I'm going to finish my graduate degree was my plan at the time. Then May 9th, 2001 happened, and I quickly got all sucked up in that very excitedly. So I literally dropped out of school, damaged my GPA in the process. No regrets for me to get involved in this and spend those 18 months approximately that I toured with the project, met all those witnesses, absolutely extraordinary, fatigued with excitement. It was how I described myself at the time for a good year, which is kind of how I feel today, frankly, fatigued with all the excitement to prepare for this event. So in the next slide, you will see kind of the results of what I did with all that. So I was so excited about the reality of the UFO phenomena, the reality of the cover-up that was proven to me very substantially through the people that I met, witnesses and others. So I was motivated, among a few other reasons, but primarily because of the Disclosure Project work, to found a nonprofit here in Ashland, Oregon that is called Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back to the slide, please, Ron. So these are the people that are in the other room helping the back end of this happen. So this is Christina Stewart, happens to be Daniel Sheehan's niece, by the way. My event coordinator, Nikki Clifton, myself, and Lori Lorenz, who you saw at the beginning of today's presentation. Next slide. These next few slides are just what we do here in Ashland, Oregon. So we have a very large book library here specializing in the UFO phenomenon. Next slide. Oh, one more back. Please go 2 more back, Ron. One more back. Right there. This is the only place in the world where a very large quantity of DVD recordings of lectures on the UFO ET phenomena exist all in one place. So you can see there's several thousand hours of recordings that, again, this doesn't exist anywhere else. So I just needed to show that off because here was my opportunity to showcase the work that we do here in Ashland. So those are lectures from UFO conferences for the last couple of decades. It happens to exist right on the other side of the wall here. So I thought that would be fun just to put it in a context. Next slide. This is our UFO book section. So just to show that we have a very large book collection here specializing on the UFO subject. There are other archives in the world, in the country, not the least of which is the Roswell museums, libraries, extraordinary. If you've never been to see that one, that's probably the best in terms of well organized and large. There's a man over in Europe named Klaus Spahn who's got an extraordinary collection too. He says he's got 2 linear kilometers of shelf space, if you can imagine that. Next slide. And so that concludes my slideshow. So I just wanted to thank all the people that were involved in pulling this together. Of course, the speakers that are there at the bottom, but also the volunteers who's done extraordinary work to pull this all off. Nobody's getting any sleep, but it's a total labor of love. So that concludes my 20 minutes here, Ron. Thank you.
Abby, you were there during all these slides that we just saw. Why don't you tell us what it was like to physically be in the halls of Congress, knocking on doors, cold calling these guys? What was that like?
The whole thing was just amazing. It was like we were talking about the other day. We, going into it, we really didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And so, the buildup towards this event was phenomenal. And once we got there and saw all the witnesses who, in my opinion, are just so brave for, a lot of them took oaths of, not non-disclosure, they took oaths not to reveal any of this information, and they felt it was so important. So the burden was really on all of us to make sure that this was done well. And I think it was a really well executed event. And it also was very well attended by the press, as Jordan pointed out. So, it was neat because the event itself was phenomenal. And then the next day, all of us, we all just took to the halls of Congress, and I had never done that before. And it really did feel, partly like civic duty doing that. That's something that we all talk about doing, but to actually do it was incredible. And the mission of what we were trying to accomplish, it felt like it was an evolutionary step for human beings. That's how it felt to us at the time. It was just, we were trying to get the phenomenon of extraterrestrial presence on the planet known to the public. We were trying to get clear the path for technologies that were, going to absolutely transform the planet. And so, it's pretty lofty what we were trying to accomplish. And
tons of this material, these videotapes that he showed, all of these copies of witness information. What was the reaction like from the government people once you gave them this stuff? How did they react to that?
I think the word we chose was polite disdain. Wasn't quite as enthusiastic, or even, we weren't even rebuffed so much. It was just more of a okay, thank you very much. We'll file this here in the garbage. No, I wouldn't say it wasn't that bad, but
feel that way at the time?
What's that?
Did you feel that's how they were responding to you at the time?
Kinda, yeah. It's just, and that's the nature. That is the nature of this topic. It is outside of the mainstream lexicon. It's outside of what's acceptable to talk about. It's outside of our economic power, political structure, all of it. The whole thing was outside the norm. And so it doesn't surprise me that they weren't like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. This is great. We'll go ahead and take it and change the world. But what we did hope for was, and I like to think it was accomplished, was that we managed to this down the road a little bit further.
This, Abby, what was your feeling at the time? Feel like this was a game changer and everything was going to be different the next day? How did you feel at the time?
Yeah, at the time we thought the world would never be the same. That this was like, the day. It's always a series of calibrating your expectations to reality, what happened. And so nothing really big happened on the surface. You never know. Even a kind act can have a huge impact. And I do believe what occurred on May 9th that year was more than a small thing. It was an enormous thing. And if on no other level, I believe that the Disclosure Project really helped to bring legitimacy to this subject. We take it for granted because we're in it. Even today, when people talk about this subject, it's not just giggles and smirks anymore. And I do believe that having an event at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Was very legitimizing for it. And having the witnesses of that caliber were also...
No question about it. Speaking of those witnesses, we have Dan Willis here, who was one of the 22 witnesses who spoke at that press conference. We all thank you for your bravery, Dan. That was truly a courageous thing at the time. We appreciate it. Could you share with us a little bit of that experience, what it was like for you? Like, walk us through. Did you do an all-day video interview initially? How did it come together?
Hey, Captain. Well, being one of the top secret military witnesses that willing to testify under oath, as each one of us stated, and being an ex-ABC newsman, I was looking at 22 cameras in the back row. The place packed, largest event in the national history, National Press Club history. And what we were disclosing was so explosive. I couldn't imagine, with this many reporters and this much coverage, we're talking about proof that our legal government's being denied access. That was, part of Daniel Sheehan's testimony. Illegal unacknowledged special access programs that are taking in trillions of dollars. We had the scientists within the unacknowledged special access programs that had zero-point energy that can completely alleviate the need for nuclear oil or coal. Anti-gravity craft that's been developed back in the 1950s that could go superluminal speeds. You have astronauts that are sworn to secrecy what happened when they actually went to the moon. NASA airbrushing the UFOs out for releasing to the public. 57 different extraterrestrial species had already been categorized by 1989, according to Clifford Stone. ET craft been shut down. Our nuclear bases, the ICBM bases. The U.S. Navy reporting in secret reports, spacecraft coming out of our oceans. That was my report. And Werner von Braun's deathbed testimony talking about future planned false flag events. You have, we first started out with the Soviets, and then the next one in line, this was May of 2001, the next one was terrorist events, which we all know what happened at 9/11, followed by rogue nations, which we now have Iran, North Korea. And the next one in line is asteroids, followed by a hoaxed alien invasion. And, Jordan did an amazing job, going down, and we all went all over Capitol Hill. We had a 500-page briefing document, and it was like, no one's going to read that. It's like, it's too huge. So, I went down into the library and I typed up a little brief summary, and, you have a copy of that. Amazing. I'd love to get a copy of that. I never saved one for myself. And we gave it to all the senators and representatives, and they're all out of the loop, obviously. I traveled with Jordan and Dr. Greer across the major cities all across the Western United States. We had standing ovations. The media would come in, and they usually sanitize what I had to say, something about infiltration, people just didn't have the time to write letters. And so I got together with a programmer, and I put together an online fax on the Disclosure Project site. I had about 30,000 faxes sent to the president. We even set up a database for international embassies all around the world. We sent all over the place. We got about, I was an admin for the website, so I asked people to send in the responses. I was curious to see how they were responding. And so about 50 or 60 letters coming back from the president and the representatives. I put them all online on the webmatrix.net. You can see all the different letters and the responses. So when you look at all the responses, basically it becomes very clear they're all out of the loop. And you can imagine if presidents, CIA directors, heads of intelligence are being denied access, they're not going to read in any of the Congress people. So, the Bush administration denied the congressional hearing in order to bring forth these witness scientists, which could prove that we have these energy solutions. So afterward, due to my technical background, I was one of 6 technical advisors that joined a corporation that Dr. Greer set up, traveling around the world, meeting with these scientists and inventors. And that continued on for 10 years. vetting these technologies from that are claimed to be over Unity. And it was just, there's, systems set up that people get anything that has anti-gravity free energy, they get one of these national security orders. So pretty much shut it down. So
Guys, when you went there, didn't you say to the Congress people that this was an energy technology instead of saying it was a UFO? That isn't that how the approach was?
well, the technology, such as Mark McCandish, who unfortunately just recently passed away, ruled a suicide, but there's something suspicious about it. The enabling technology is zero-point energy that allows these anti-gravity craft to do what they do. This is, it actually goes back to ancient India and the Brahmanas and using mercury. The Nazi Germany had developed anti-gravity back in 1934 with the help of a somewhat predatory race that's on this planet that achieved advanced technology, which the United States wasn't able to until 1954, which gave them like a 20-year advanced technological lead over the United States, and was able to infiltrate into the United States. And during the Eisenhower administration, agreements and surrenders were set up. And this is what actually led to the National Press Club event, because ever since President Eisenhower was denied access, this going back to 1955, every single president, CIA director, heads of intelligence was denied access. This meeting that Dr. Greer had with Dr. Edgar Mitchell and Commander Will Miller at the Pentagon with the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Vice Admiral Thomas Wilson, he was showed a NRO classified document that had a distribution list of these unacknowledged special access programs that the corporations were reverse engineering the extraterrestrial technology, and he was denied access. He was furious. He told Dr. Greer, if you can get your people together that are willing, basically to testify under oath, you have my permission to go to the media with this. This was 1997. This group is illegal, quote unquote. And so that is essentially what greenlighted the May 9th, 2001 National Press Club.
Wow. At that event, Regina, you were actually journalist covering that. Can you share what it was like to be in that position? What was it? What was the feeling in that room?
Oh my God. Oh my God. I was thinking, I was so humbled. My testimony was just a small fragment, compared to what the other witnesses were saying. I was actually, I think I was a fill-in, I found out later, for David Adair, his testimony is a bit on the pushing the envelope, you could say. And so, I volunteered, to fill in. I was looking at the explosive testimonies these other witnesses were giving. And I was looking at the cameras, and the place is packed. And I'm thinking, oh my God, after today, the world is never going to be the same. This has to be a world-changing event. How could, I was so naive, even though I've been researching ever since 1969 when I had my military experience, in naval communications. I've been researching through the years, and in 2001, I didn't even know what Operation Mockingbird was. So for the last 20 years, I've been deeply researching all these witness testimonies and authenticated classified documents, attempting over time to see what the corroborating picture is of the large picture of why did the mainstream, being an ex-ABC newsman, I couldn't imagine what happened. Why did the media did what's called the intelligence community calls it a limited hangout. In other words, CNN, for example, made it sound like we wanted to have a congressional hearing on the reality of UFOs, which totally sanitized the explosive testimonies that indicate that our government has been basically infiltrated by these unwarranted influences that Eisenhower attempted to warn us about. And, looking back, I realized that, the Nazi SS did have a plan to infiltrate in. and take over education, media, which they did in 1950. They took over education in 1946, rewrote what happened at the end of World War II. And then the Nazi SS in 1954 set up the Bilderberg meetings, which along with the Council on Foreign Relations, control the 6 corporations that control the mainstream media that all of us are exposed to in the hundreds of channels that they centrally control. So, I started to realize that after the press club, CBS wanted to do an interview with me. And I told them, I saw what CNN did with it. I said, look, I'm not doing this interview unless you can guarantee that I can say, we have the scientists that can prove we have 0-point energy in an open congressional hearing, put it on the table, show that it works. They promised up and down, interviewed me for 45 minutes. The producer was almost in tears. She said, I know, I promise, I never had this happen before. The higher executives, which you find the CIA at the highest level, made me cut that part out. And so why would you cut out a solution? Especially, this was in 2001, there was rolling blackouts happening in California at that time. You remember, Jordan. In fact, some of the meetings that we attended. Why would the media cut out a solution to the world? So you have these elements that are centrally controlling our mainstream media. And this is what I pretty much focus on. That's my kind of individual, after 20 years of research, digging deep into this, is that we have a domestic enemy that's operating behind the mainstream media.
Okay, let's go to media here. Regina, I was asking you that you were a journalist covering the event. You tell us what you felt it was like, the feeling in the room at the time, please.
Well, I had been, just as a tiny bit of background, I had been out in the field with Stephen Greer prior to this, out doing field research with him prior to the disclosure event, which is what encouraged me to join up with the team and be part of that disclosure event. But the reason I was in the field with him initially was part of research to take a project that was called UFOs Hard Evidence to PBS. I had already met with the execs, the programming directors at PBS. I already was involved in that system and a producer for them. And we were going to take the great leap of bringing this subject forward. So I had actually engaged the McNeil-Lehrer crew to shoot this event. Videotape for me at the event, but due to some kind of unforeseen last-minute politics, that crew was not allowed in the building. So I was without camera and crew to document any of it. However, as a journalist, I was still there with my own agenda, my own observations to try to forward this information. And I think one of the things that struck me most deeply was the sincerity, the incredible sincerity and fear of the witnesses. And I remember, and as I'm sure you three probably do as well, a couple of the older gentlemen who had been in the military and had been very closely preserving, holding on to their national security oaths until that moment. Little men, by this time shriveled with age, their epaulets on their shoulders and their little medals and badges of honor, as it were, in the military, in tears when they were not. In fact, a couple did break down during the event itself, but behind the scenes, these men were in tears out of the fear of the repercussions of not only what would happen to their lives after revealing this information, but probably because of the sheer power of letting go after all these years of holding these secrets. I found that part to be really a heartrending human piece of all of this, because when we get down to it, we're talking about UFOs, aliens, government agencies, but the human piece is the part that has often been ignored. And for that reason, I was in the halls with you guys, passing out the same literature in Congress, and I would call the word at best maybe condescending, because you have to remember, this never made it to any of the members of Congress or the Senate of the House of Representatives or Senate, most likely. These were 20-year-old, 20-something-year-old aides to aides that would come out and take these documents and most likely toss them in the trash can. Certainly nothing came of it. But in terms of media beyond that, one of the moments in that event, which I certainly could relate to, having been in the newsroom, was one journalist stood up, and the others may recall, I think they were the ones with Washington, D.C. local news who had come to cover it. And when someone in the audience said, "If this is real, how come we've never heard about it?" And he angrily got up and shouted, "Because this isn't going to go anywhere. We're not allowed to speak about it." And I flashed back to many years earlier when I was in the newsroom. I remember approaching the news director at that time. I had just read something coming over the Reuters wire about a very highly witnessed event in Europe, UFO sighting in Europe. And I thought that as I read about it and realized the dignitaries and such in town, policemen and so forth who had witnessed it, I thought, well, certainly this is exciting enough to put on our, nightly news here. And the answer was immediately no. We do not cover this stuff. So I had learned many years before. So for me to think, okay, I already have a seat at the table at PBS. If we can really pull this off, and of course, a big part of it was being able to film these witnesses, talk to them behind the scenes, get these stories, really look into the evidence of it as the kind of the backbone of the UFO hard evidence documentary. That I thought was going to, just like everyone in the room that day, I thought, yes, it'll be out on PBS. This will change the story. And I look in hindsight, even at what's happening today, I'm aware of various people in this field, people who are doing research still to this day. And I'm aware that the same kind of intimidation, the tapped phone lines, the phone calls of intimidation, the untimely deaths, these things are occurring. They've been occurring all along. They're occurring to this day. Whatever the people that hide whatever they feel needs to be hidden have not loosened up on this story beyond what they choose to leak through their very carefully selected sources, such as the New York Times and, of course, this week's article in the New Yorker magazine. Depending on who's reading it, you have to say, is the media starting to become significant in this story? I would have to agree that as of November of 2017, with the New York Times release of those stories, and then again, the New Yorker magazine this week, and I hear there's something coming up on 60 Minutes this weekend as well. I would have to say it is making a difference. And I would say just one conversation I had yesterday with someone who is a hardcore German intellectual who had read the New Yorker magazine, who's been highly skeptical of all of this all along. He said, "You know what? I think that was a fair and balanced piece." Now, any of us reading it might say there was a little snark there, but if you look at it from a public consumption point of view of people that are not in this field of research, it's actually significant in what it brings forward. And I think our ability to be patient and nuanced in our thinking is incredibly important at this time where we're having dribs and drabs of disclosure, which have been happening for decades, as we know, but right now the more public, forthcoming information. And Leslie Kean has been certainly the journalist of choice that they've used to release this information through, along with a couple of their other staffers. And I would have to say overall, even if we would object to some of the treatment of Dr. Greer in that article, for example, there are a few little remarks I would take exception to. I think he did a historic job at that event.
No doubt. George, do you want to jump in here? I can see your.
Yes, thank you. Just to echo some of the points that Regina's making. And we're all so excited about doing this. This is just such an incredible opportunity to reminisce about these things. But 2 points that I wanted to just extend that Regina and Dan just said regarding how the witnesses were experiencing the whole thing. So part of what was so exciting for me was how I'm speaking about the 22 people that testified May 9th on the panel there at the press club. These are, like Regina said, very high-ranking people, very serious people that are not going to make up stories and are not in this to sell books, et cetera, et cetera. And they were there, somewhat reluctantly, some of them, very nervous about what was getting ready to happen. So somehow because of that, like sociologically perhaps, those people, I'm speaking about the 22 witnesses, would look at me and the rest of the staff as their heroes that were giving them opportunity to come forward and cathartically share the kinds of things that they weren't able to come home and share at the dinner table with their families over their 20-something plus careers. I just wanted to just speak to a little bit the human elements of this, the psychology and the sociology of this that was so present in that room that morning. And the pictures, of course, don't capture it, but all of us that were there know what I'm speaking about. And I just wanted to telegraph some of that to the audience here, just to underscore again how significant that those couple hours there at the press club were. Also, the piece about what's been happening in the media since. I'm glad that Leslie Kean was mentioned, and a few other journalists like herself that hold an extraordinarily high bar. I just have to compliment people like Leslie for, she just won't touch anything unless it checks out 6 different ways sideways. So I just really want to compliment and congratulate a true professional journalist in the traditional sense. This doesn't exist, unfortunately, as much as it did back in the day. And it's an unfortunate circumstance how journalism isn't what it used to be. So I just wanted to really applaud people like yourself, Regina, and certainly people like Leslie Kean, who hold an extraordinarily high bar, as is necessary. And that's why it's worth complimenting that, of course, this subject needs to be treated extraordinarily, carefully with regard to who checks out, et cetera. Go ahead, Regina.
I was just going to add to that, Jordan, and anyone else jump in. The interesting thing is until it reaches a certain level of credulity, the public at large, is certainly the well-educated public at large, is not going to be inclined to buy into this or pick it up. And so what happens oftentimes is those in the field and the witnesses themselves, the witnesses that Alan Hynek, who was, of course, the scientist engaged by the military intelligence industry to review these cases under Project Blue Book, finally came out, wrote his own book, and said Project Blue Book was really nothing but a cover. And he expressed his incredible respect and sentiment for the actual people who are who have been the witnesses and the contactees throughout these decades, who had the courage against ridicule and harassment by local governments, family, etc., to speak up. And then the people who are the boots on the ground researchers that have gone out for year after year. One of them I'm dealing with right now in an interview next week at Gaia. I'm going to be interviewing Jacques Vallée and Paula Harris on their new book, Trinity, a 12-year case. Paula was in the field with these people for 12 years. Jacques Vallée came in a couple of years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, and said, this is an incredible case of not just UFO history, of our history in science, because this particular event happened 1 week after the first atomic blast in the world. And looking at the link between those and the kids, the local native kids in the field who saw this and their families that became involved, this has caused a great deal of pain for all of these individuals. And they're the ones that are so easily dismissed in the story. And I just want to say I have immense respect for the people who have come forward beyond the military, the average person that has unexpectedly had these encounters. And then the boots on the ground researchers, such as what Paola's been doing all these years to create this incredible book that's coming out in a couple of weeks. That's called Trinity, the Best Kept Secret by Sheehan and Jacques Vallée. I want to say I think they deserve our respect too, even though their work is at the rudimentary stage. On the ground stage, it hasn't been piled over and combed through and the relevant pieces put together into a highly groomed piece that is acceptable to the public. I think we need to accept that these researchers need to be respected from the ground all the way up to whatever comes out in the New York Times for public consumption. I think that's really important.
Dan, did you want to comment on what Jordan was saying and Regina were saying about how felt supported by these guys and what it was like?
As far as support in,
like Jordan was speaking to, the speakers felt like testifying, how they felt about everybody giving them this platform to share their story.
oh well, so it was kind of intimidating, to look at all those 22 cameras in the place packed. I know I was quite nervous with my testimony. I just thought they did an incredible job.
Thank you very much.
I'm
here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just did a show yesterday with Laura Eisenhower and the grandson of Daniel Slater, who was the, I guess, the 22nd witness, although there's or the 21st witness, where 20 of us gave a testimony. But he had like a kind of a mini stroke when he came up to the microphone, which is kind of sad because he had a high-level Cosmos clearance, which he was involved in the extraterrestrial issue. Yeah, I was just shocked that the testimonies, it went viral on the internet. It inspired a lot of people, inspired Dr. Michael Salla, inspired a hacker in the UK, Gary McKinnon, who they wanted to put him away 7 years in prison because he discovered the US Navy's secret space program, the Solar Warden program. So it went viral on the internet, but you only got about a minute and a half, or at that most, on the mainstream media outlets, CNN and ABC, CBS, all of that. So that was, that was basically what kept the event from being a world-changing event, was the control of the media. And, I see the media as essentially infiltrated and enemy of the public.
You seem like all of you guys feel the same way, that you expected this to be much bigger and profound when it happened. When did those illusions dissipate for you that, okay, the world's not a different place? Was it the next day? Was it the
Yes.
time? It was.
Definitely by the next day, because as Dan was stating, actually, Dan, it was the second largest attended event after Monica Lewinsky's blue dress.
Oh, that's
at the
right.
National Press Club to that day. So this was a packed room with press from all over the world. Those cameras, very, very few of them were from the United States. They were from all over the world. And I was able to get feedback through Greer's team that there was some pickup in England, for example, at the time. There was a little bit in France, Japan, but not in the United States. And so to further what was going on here in our country, to try to release this through the American witnesses, it seemed pretty clear that what that man who stood up in the audience and raised his hand said was accurate. They're not going to air it. And in fact, the one piece that did come out in the US was really quite snarky. It pretty much devalued everything that was said that day. And I was very disappointed to see that. And I have to say, and maybe there was a rhyme and reason to it, since we're just now getting around to this being leaked out through mainstream sources. Maybe the time wasn't just yet. It certainly scuttled my documentary. I thought, if this is what we're dealing with, I'm not going to beat my head against the wall. I'm going to go ahead and move on to other projects. And I see now, because of what happened to so many people that really tried to pursue this at that level, maybe it was all intended in some, larger way that we can't see, because the time wasn't ripe yet. But it was very disappointing for every one of us in the room. This was so huge. How could it be ignored with that many cameras trained on it? Yet it was.
Let's go to Abby for a second. Abby, tell us a little bit about how this was a grassroots thing, how you guys were actually like boots on the ground doing this.
Well, it's a question. I mean, this subject is something that people are I believe that everybody kind of knows this is a real subject, and that they're just waiting. And I'm answering your question in sort of a roundabout way. They're waiting and for the announcement from the president. They're waiting for the mainstream media to announce it. However, when you talk about this subject intelligently, people come out of the woodwork to tell you an experience they had, or someone they know had an experience. And people have to get over that, got something to tell you, but don't tell anybody else. So as far as the grassroots goes, I think it was a good opportunity for people who know this is real, who feel like it's important, who know that it's important. It did give people an outlet to do something about it rather than just talk amongst ourselves. And it did give people a sensible, legitimate, democratic way to participate in intergovernmental process to try to push this further along. You know, Greer is very charismatic and able to draw a lot of attention to this, you know, through his own channels. It is really tragic that, you know, as Regina was talking about, it's super tragic. It was really gut-wrenching the next day when there was just nothing. It was crickets. And, you know, but I think being that it still wasn't at that mainstream level, it did still give those who were engaged that opportunity to do something that really felt like what we're supposed to do. I mean, as an adult, I have found that almost everything you've been taught in school isn't really how anything is or how anything works. And it's pretty disappointing. And this was no exception to that. But still, as I said earlier, I do feel like the participation of so many people, and thank you, Jordan, for your work on the ground, getting people to write those letters. I mean, that is significant. I do think that engaging in this process, and that is actually one of the takeaways from meeting with our congressional representatives, is they said, sometimes we want to do something, but unless we have the people behind us demanding that we do it, there's too much pressure coming in the other direction. Move forward. And they're like, please, please, please push us to do things, because we actually can't unless we hear from you. So, I mean, on that level, you know, that was a good thing to learn. And that was something that I always like to remind people, even though it seems sort of pointless and it doesn't work. It isn't pointless, and it does work to some degree.
Jordan, this went on, you showed us in the slides earlier that this went on for months after the actual event.
Yeah, well, I only
there?
had a few minutes to show those slides.
Yeah, and how was that received when you guys were going to all these different cities, Portland and whatever? How was that received? Was there skepticism on the road, or were people interested in this topic?
Thanks, Ron, for bringing me back to that. That's something I meant to include in my earlier presentation with those slides. So the answer is the reception from just ordinary citizens coming to those speaking events that we did across the country, extraordinary. And that's why I'm glad I had a few pictures to just give a hint to the kinds of crowds that we were getting, and the kinds of willingness that people were willing to do to stay after the events and write those letters and get them mailed and that kind of stuff. And like has already been said, the journalism, like Regina already kind of said it, my experience on May 9th in the room at the National Press Club, watching those journalists assemble early in the day, acting like this was just another ordinary assignment, and I have some other pictures somewhere that speak to that. But then to watch them over the course of the testimonies, to literally see their jaws just drop open. So like everybody in that room knew something very significant was happening, and as was being shared. And as Regina said, somewhere between those journalists leaving that room and the editor's desk is where something went haywire. And there's been a lot of speculation about how much orchestration existed there, or my speculation, de jure, 20 years later, not so much that there was, you know, men in dark suits pulling strings on things, although I certainly don't rule that out. It's just more about like I was saying, the sociology of it. There's a stigma that's attached to this. Dan knows about it. What is it, 1952 CIA Robertson panel, that taxpayer dollars were spent back then to hire advertising agencies, including the Walt Disney Corporation, to put some negative spin on the whole subject. That to me is extraordinary. How come that in itself, just that little bit in itself, isn't a focal point of all this work? So again, the reception in the room, May 9th, journalists, extraordinary. Reception in the halls of Congress, that 4 or 5 days that we all stayed there to literally do the grassroots knock on door sort of stuff, which Abby was speaking to, and she was very present with, as was Regina and Dan. Those exciting adventures for us, I'll say. So that was tepid at best. You know, the circular file ideas, how we were joking about that, all that paper that I took out of the copy center, for example, did that really, you know, end up on any senator's desks? I'd like to think a little bit of it did. All those VHS tapes, did any of that stuff get watched? Probably a little bit, but like was spoken. And I heard Regina say it, and this is the way I tell that story too, those staffers, the people that we were handing that material to was the 20-year-old staffers that had no attention span for any of that. There was little coffee stands all over the place. Everybody was fully caffeinated. There was all these CNN screens everywhere in the halls of Congress. And one way I tell the story too, the little nameplates on the staffers' desks, the little plate that has a person's name, about who's sitting at that particular desk, interchangeable letters on that person's name pad. Those people just cycled to those positions so quickly on their way to other positions, and that to me such an education in itself about how the wheels of government really work in those kinds of environments. So that's my response to your question there, Ron. Thank you.
Dan, you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, Jordan, absolutely correct. Yeah, I remember going to what was it called, Jordan? It was the Science Technology Division. I remember walking in and saying, hey, we just were at the National Press Club and presenting this information, and we, and immediately she said, let me show you how things are done here on Capitol Hill. In other words, they have their way of processing the information, and some of the senators and Congress people, they were very few were receptive to it. It's pretty much a hot potato, not on my watch, I don't want to deal with it type of thing. And nobody's going to nobody has the time to read 500-page briefing document or go through a 4-hour VHS tape of all these witnesses and everything. That's why we gave that little brief paper that you showed, Jordan, to everybody, because the fact that the paper was saying, I forgot exactly what it was saying, it was 20 years ago, that we have a solution basically, to end the energy environmental crisis. I mean, wouldn't that get someone's attention?
I would think so. I'm shocked that it wasn't more.
Jordan, is it brief? Can you read what it says on it? I forgot what it says.
Oh, well, I just was doing some show and tell with one of these what I regard as a historic document. This is the stuff, among other things, that we distributed in the halls of Congress. The stuff I ran into that copy center to make more of. Did you want me to just read the first sentence on the front page? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Just it's a brief overview to get a flavor of what we were handing to the congressmen and senators, that just to seed their, because they're not going to open the 500-page briefing doc. They're too busy.
So my screen froze there again, unfortunately, but I'll just read the first sentence of this briefing document that was, like Dan said, hand delivered to everybody. Every like 450 plus 200 or something like that were hand delivered. This document contains an overview of the issues surrounding the UFO ETI topics, that's extraterrestrial intelligence topics, including background information and implications, summaries of military and government witnesses' testimonies of experience with UFO ETI, and recommendations for action. That's the cover letter of the document that we distributed to all the Congress people.
Did it say anything about a solution to the energy environmental crisis with technology? Nothing of that nature?
Oh, well, that's in here, of course, but I didn't want to go too deeply into this. So in the table of contents, of course, it talks about that, breaks it out into a few different areas, but of course, that's one of them. And not just energy, by the way, recommendations of scientific community actions, for example. Interestingly, this morning, I found this document as a PDF online. I didn't save the link, but this isn't a private document anymore. It's public.
No, I don't even have a copy. Send me a link sometime. I'd like to see it for historical purposes.
Right, will do. It is a historic document. I regard it that way too, Dan.
Hey, Regina, you went to some of these live events. What were they like?
Mostly I attended the field research with Stephen. And then after disclosure, I did not go to the other live events. So I would not be able to comment on that. There was something that was occurring that day, though, I thought I'd just throw in because you guys might remember this. In terms of, again, trying to thwart this information moving forward, do you remember, Stephen Greer, there was a panic before the event started, just as the event started, because they had found some people, who knows who they were, climbing around on the roof. And what it had done is it had crashed the live stream, and it had more people ready to log on, I think, than any event for live stream. Again, except for possibly the Monica Lewinsky story. And so there was some concern that there were entities that were trying to stop this from going out to the world at all. I think they were able to eventually restore that feed, but that's what was going on behind the scenes. Everybody was hustling around just before the event started. Oh my God. So the whole thing was fraught with every kind of attempt to keep the information, away from the individual. So to answer your question, I did not go to the other live events. I was busy starting up another project at that time where I could continue covering the UFO story through various authors and witnesses. So I was off on that project doing it through my own journalistic
Well, then
team.
why don't you tell me, journalistically, why don't you tell me how you see how the media's attitude on disclosure has changed during this 20-year period from event till now?
Yeah, as you spoke about before, I mean, first of all, we do have to credit a certain amount of fiction and where that comes in terms of sheer entertainment. I personally think it was extraordinary that the History Channel picked up Project Blue Book. I assume everybody's seen it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And even though it was fictionalized, Alan Hynek's son, Paul Hynek, was an advisor in terms of content. And I believe Alex's wife, Mimi, was also involved in that to oversee content and editorial in it. Granted, it was made spectacular and beautiful with Russian spies and all this stuff. But the general feeling that Hynek started, that the government was working against him and using him as a shill for their stories, I think that was a very important message to come across in those first 2 seasons. I think they've abandoned production from what Paul said. I don't think they're doing any further seasons unless something's changed in the last couple of months. But just that alone, which I believe was the most viewed show historically on History Channel, that reached millions and millions of people. Now, granted, a lot of them think it's pure fiction, but it did do a good job of stating these are from the files, and they showed the name of the actual file and original photographs and so forth. That is a really big step in my mind, putting it out in that way, even if it's somewhat dampened with, fictitious elements to it, to lay the foundation for what happened historically. So I think we're moving in the right direction. What I'm concerned about, this whole new legislative attempt to take a look into this aerial phenomena, first of all, it's been looked into for decades, but however Mark Rubio and these people want to position it, that's on them. But the notion that it's even being brought up again in Congress in this way is interesting. It gets people's attention. It gets headlines that this is something real. It's my greatest hope that they do not try to position this as a threat to humanity. I've been reading the language. The linguistics are really important in this. When we read the articles and see the subtle language that's being put in, you start seeing that there is a bit of a prejudice that's indicating these things are a risk of some kind to humanity on some level. I would like to think we can get past that part of the story and start looking at it as something that can be an open sense of wondrous discovery and collaboration rather than positioning as a threat, so that, as Eisenhower stated, it's just drawing in more funds for the military intelligence industry. That would be very disappointing to me at this stage of the game, and I'm seeing little hints of that happening right now.
Great. Hopefully that'll change. Abby, can you give us some insights? You had some behind the scenes stuff. Like, what about the dinner the night before the press conference? I think you were there with Daniel Sheehan talking to everybody. How did that go? What was it like?
That was personally for me one of the most impactful evenings of my life. We were in the it was just the witnesses and some of the staffers, and as Regina mentioned earlier, the emotional state of many of the witnesses was very intense because of the nature of what they were about to do. And that was kind of like the pep talk that night before. And Daniel Sheehan, who I believe is presenting here soon, Danny gave just a really life-changing speech on how it doesn't take a lot of people to make a big difference. And in fact, usually most large shifts in the world are actually initiated by a few very, very dedicated people. And, you know, that is exactly how I believe the witnesses approached this. I do believe that they felt we're creating a seismic shift world. And I really appreciate what Regina is saying and about, you know, the conversation about this whole subject. It's such an important subject for us as a species. And, you know, I mean, if there are other life forms here that are intelligent, that is an incredibly important thing that we need to understand and we need to know about. And the way it's framed is just so important. That wasn't really necessarily what we were trying to do with the Disclosure Project, but I just think it's important enough to mention, because certainly in our own history on this planet, when a quote unquote superior group of people or beings come across another group of people or beings who aren't as sophisticated, doesn't always end well. And, you know, and we do need to be informed. And that's not to say that their intentions are nefarious necessarily. But it is important to understand it. And I do believe that the people of this planet have the right to know what's going on, who's here, why, how can there, you know, how is this going to impact us as a species? They're really, really things. And it's just a personal beef I have, because I get very tired of the conversation in the UFO community. I could not care less about lights in the sky. I'm over it, because that's not what's important. I don't care if it's people who want to talk about if it's real or not can go sit at the children's table. That's not what the conversation needs to be anymore. The conversation really needs to move forward to, you know, who are these beings? Why are they here? How are we connected to them? What are the impacts for the human race? And I've been waiting for that conversation for a long time. I still don't feel like it's really happening, but the Disclosure Project was, you know, that was supposed to be the first step in that direction. So yes, the way the conversation is framed is incredibly important. And that is something that Greer talks about a lot as well. And
go ahead.
Important that it's not just a fear-based. I mean, the War of the Worlds broadcast, that was such a damaging thing. It was Wells, you know, they did it as a radio. For those who don't know, I'm sure most people know, it was broadcast as if there was an alien invasion actually happening. And some people did not know it was a fictional account, and people actually committed suicide. And it was like, that was like the first step in this framing of the whole phenomenon the wrong way. You know, just absolutely injecting fear into the world. That, you know, maybe there is a reason to be afraid. I don't know, but we don't need to approach it that way. I think the more intelligent way would be one of curiosity, guarded curiosity, and open-mindedness. Not.
No doubt. Jordan, we obviously at these conferences in today's world, we get approached by people all the time. I've got video. I saw this. They have stories to tell. What was it like at your events back then after this press conference? Did people come up to you then and say, hey, I've got stories to share? Or was it too new and they weren't ready to do that yet?
Oh, I think you're asking, Ron, what happened during the speaking tour with Stephen Greer as we went around the country?
Correct.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that part out. These are part of the Untold Histories of the Disclosure Project, and we're just scratching the surface here, of course, by the way, for people that are listening. Well, part of what was so extraordinary for me about that was, just like you said, Ron, lots of other people came up to me specifically as Steve Greer's assistant in that role. The way I tell the story is my briefcase would be noticeably heavier, significantly heavier, as I would leave those events at the end of the night. So much paper was dumped on us, VHS tapes and videos, and mostly paper and books and the kinds of stuff that people found in the grandma's attic sort of stuff. I mean, and that material would be given to me, stuff it in my briefcase. The next morning, the protocol was for me to take it to a Kinko's, put all that stuff on a fax tray. Again, this is 2001, remember. Scan all that material, send it off to Emily Greer at the home office, Stephen's wife, as like, you know, faxes, stuff all that material into several FedEx envelopes, mail it off. I never saw that material to speak of. It just flowed right through me, I held on to it overnight, and it was just an extraordinary amount of stuff. What became of all that, I don't know. So many people that were potential witnesses, so many people that had funding connections, so many people that had media connections, all that sort of stuff. There was extraordinary response from that. I don't know what became of any of that material. Of course, it stuck with me. I did find one little example of that. I don't quite have it here. Just one that didn't quite make it
Raiders
into
of
the
the Lost
envelope.
Ark warehouse, Jordan, I'm pretty sure.
Correct.
I want to ask each of you to address this question. Where do you think this movement's heading forward, going forward from now? Obviously, things have opened up since 2017. We've seen a lot more coming out the last few years. Why don't we start with you, Dan? Where do you think this is going to head?
Yeah, great question. Speaking of control of the narrative, they had about I don't remember the exact figure, maybe 500,000 people signed on online to see the National Press Club event, but it was jammed for the first hour and a half or so. And they found, according to sources at NSA. So they really didn't want the public to see the actual, live feed of what was being disclosed. So today, there's a 180-day, for the hearing or the Senate hearing on the UFO AP that's coming up just next month in June. And, they're going to release, it's mandated to release to all 18 intelligence agencies all UFO data. And so this is a time when the narrative could be, how do you say, spun or directed toward an agenda. I'm looking at, when I'm looking at things from a newsman perspective, looking at what comes out of the New York Times, what gets promoted on the History Channel, what the language is of an alien threat, that they keep, putting out there. We know that, my personal belief is the vast majority of extraterrestrial races, I've had a few experiences, they've all been benevolent. I believe most of them are benevolent and benign, but, I don't know about all of them. I know the Nazi Germany entered into an alliance a long time ago, but I would be very, very suspicious of which way the narrative is going to be directed at this upcoming, I guess it's kind of like it's going to be kind of a global world disclosure event in a way that they reveal this to all our intelligence agency. I don't know what they're going to reveal to the public, but I would scrutinize it heavily and recommend everyone do their due diligence and do research from multiple sources. And I have my own perspective, but my take on it.
Okay, Regina, why don't you give us your comment on where you think we're headed with disclosure?
Well, I agree with everything Dan said. And as I said in my last comment, one can only hope that this is not being spun as a negative, but as something that's worth a collaborative investigation, true investigation. We'll see if that report even comes out in June. I think they had a previous one that never came out, that was promised and never came out. And this seems to be pretty typical. It actually never surfaces. Because of mainstream media now, there's a little more pressure, I think, to do this. And as I mentioned, I'll be curious to see the nature of the 60-minute report. That's a very big venue. We'll see how they language it and spin it. But I wrote this down because I thought this is how it is. This is a comment by Jacques Vallée in the Trinity book. It says here, any disclosure will be managed by the same groups that have safely managed the dossier for the last 75 years, and they can spin it to their liking. I think that is a statement of fact, and we can only cross our fingers as to what that spin is going to be. But beyond that, it's not about them. It's about us. It's about the people. And I think the subject is actually being normalized. We have so many different programs coming out now that the notion that aliens are among us, that we might ourselves be hybrids and aliens, this is becoming kind of common fare in entertainment. So I think the subject that we're not alone in the universe, I think that's kind of done and dusted in most quarters of the planet. I think most people do understand we're not the only and most intelligent species in the universe. And so I think it is going to be normalized through the various media releases. And then we can choose how each one of us wants to engage with it, as Dan said.
Jordan, how about you?
Thanks. I concur with what's been said. Just wanted to underscore 2 points. And it's been so fun to revisit these memories. I just have to take a pause and say how cool this is to be up here on this virtual stage with my dear friends here recounting these extraordinary life-changing experiences. I just couldn't help but say that again. So on the idea about where it's all headed. So the few times that I've had opportunity in the last 20 years to tell these kinds of stories to people, I'll say something to the effect of, and I'm not the disclosure advocate I was then. And what I mean by that is what Steve Bassett has called the capital D disclosure. I call it we interrupt this news broadcast from an announcement from the president to say that we've been lied to our entire lives, and everything that we learned in 8th grade civics is not true. Way too disruptive to do it that way. There's still a large call to do that. And I'm just going to say here publicly that I'm very concerned that the people within the UFO community that feel so unheard and ridiculed are calling for that style of disclosure, capital D disclosure, what I would call very disruptive, unnecessarily so disruptive, are doing it from a sense of personal vindication. So I'm just going to caution people to be really careful how they call for that style of disclosure. So the idea, I forget Regina's term for it, other people have called it the slow drip, the soft disclosure, I like to think of it as. It's happened very slowly, quietly through mainstream media. A lot of the B movies, actually, we all know the blockbuster movies that touch on these subjects, but you got to watch the B movies on this. That's where a lot of disclosure seems to be happening. I'm not alleging necessarily that CIA and others are actually authoring Hollywood scripts, but boy, you sure have to wonder sometimes. The X-Files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a good example, actually, the X-Files. That's a whole other story. But things like that, I guess, is exactly what I'm speaking to, that it's been a much more comfortable, much more humane, much less disruptive opening for humanity collectively to be able to approach these issues without being shocked into it. So that's a strong distinction I wanted to make. So where is it all headed? I think what both Dan and Regina just said, that the narrative is going to continue to be controlled is a worrisome and unfortunate circumstance, but I think that is just a fact. So I encourage people to do their own research. The places like the library that I just showed you here in the few slides that I did, not too many places like this around the world, but thanks to the internet, although discernment is certainly necessary there. So there's good information out there if people are willing to put nose to the grindstone and learn about it more. So thank you again, everybody, for participating like this.
Abby, where do you think it's headed?
Got to turn your mic on, Abby.
Sorry. I was just going to say the nature of information has changed so much in the last 20 years. And, the internet really forced the hand of mainstream media. It took control out of single source information dissemination to multiple source. And that was such a wonderful boon for the UFO community and these type of subjects. Unfortunately, it's kind of come full circle now. And I do think it is difficult to find accurate information. It's all out there, truth along with the lies. And so, I think it's unstoppable at this point. I mean, in fact, I feel like the truth, the information is already out there. So it is a difficult road, I would say, finding your way through the information, the disinformation, the spin, all of that. And as the documentary Social Dilemma and also just our political minefield that we're in right now, where people are just, you almost have to go with your gut because you can prove anything these days with the internet. And so I'm excited, but yet I'm also, I don't know, despairing is not quite the right word, but it's frustrating to me that it is so hard to find and then verify information. So you do have to find and verify and then re-verify and then double check and then, gather with people that, it's a tricky thing. But I think as disclosure itself, it's unstoppable. It's already out there and it's only going to become more and more out there. So I think it's just here to stay and grow.
We literally just have 2 minutes left, but I want to really quick just go right through the same 4 again and find out, looking now 20 years later, how this experience, when you look back on it, for each of you was. Was it fun? Was it stressful? How was it for you now that you're looking back 20 years later? Dan, how do you feel about it 20 years later?
It was enlightening. It was enlightening that it was hopeful. when I heard the testimonies. Just imagine if these technologies were released, the deep state, whatever you want to, cabal, whatever you want to, was fully revealed, and the technologies released. They have technologies that can heal any disease. We can transform the world, to be, not the way it is now, but to make it a beautiful heaven on earth. The technologies that work in harmony with nature. I mean, everything with what was being disclosed could be released. It could transform the world as we know it to a completely different experience for all beings on this planet. And and that's what was most inspiring to me, is that the potential for transformation was the most inspiring thing, I think, from that event that I attended 20 years ago.
Right. What about you, Regina?
Absolutely life-changing event. And again, it was not just the UFOs and ET aspect of it, it was the human element of it. And understanding that humans have been having these exposures for thousands of years. I mean, arguably back to our very beginnings as the human species, I think is something we need to look at on a much deeper level than just technology, even though that what's possible through these new technologies is absolutely exquisite. I think we need to look at it on a larger level. And as I said before, hopefully in a fearless and more open-minded way. There's much more to the universe than just us.
What about you, Jordan?
Oh, beautiful, both of you guys. Regina, I'm just reminded to make my comment. Well, certainly life-changing, extraordinary, fatigued with excitement, like I said before, is how I spent most of 2001, 2002. Very happy to do it. I would not be interested in spirituality and metaphysics if it wasn't for my understanding of the UFO phenomenon. I was interested in paranormal subjects. A whole other 2-hour lecture about how I got into this subject with a roommate's extraordinary stories I was exposed to in 1988. And I studied it very much in the closet, especially back then. You don't talk about this kind of stuff at cocktail parties. I would put all my books away when my friends would come over. It was a very strange, stressful experience for me very personally when I first got interested in these subjects. So I never really have had any kind of paranormal experiences, UFO experiences myself. It's the weight of the testimonies that tipped me over the scale. So that's why, among other reasons, May 9th, 2001 was such a demark. There was no denying it at all after that point. And when you meet those people, something I meant to say earlier when I was saying about the cathartic thing, the relationships I've sustained with some of those witnesses for these 20 years certainly wouldn't be possible if there wasn't the connection between us and the regard that we have for each other. So just that piece on a personal level, absolutely extraordinary. There was one other piece I wanted to add. Thank you. I know we're just about out of time. I want to give Abby her time on the idea about space weaponry and things like that. And the idea that, is there anything to fear from extraterrestrials? I like the way Abby said it. It's an open question. I still feel I'm certainly not an advocate for space weaponry. Don't hear me wrong on that one. Is there something to be concerned about with regard to human ET contact? Open question for me. I think there are potentially great dangers there. And I think that another way I say it with this subject and others is I just want to be an advocate for bringing humanity's best and brightest minds to bear on these incredibly important subjects. I don't really feel that too many people within the UFO research community, don't take any offense on anybody, are not resourced enough to study these issues at the way that they are certainly deserving. So that's mostly how I approach this when I make any kind of public statements, which I almost never do, by the way. That's what I would like to call for, bringing humanity's best and brightest minds to bear on these incredibly important subjects that have tremendous implications to us all. Not enough of the humanities resources have been devoted to date, in my strong opinion. So that's partly what drives me. Go ahead, Abby.
Hard to know what's left to say about this, but as an experience, it was epic. It was fun. It was disappointing. It was everything that you can imagine. It was full spectrum. And I agree with everything everybody has said. I do feel like this is a subject that has such an important impact on us that we have to take it seriously. We have to take it carefully. Can't be hot-headed about it. It's not a subject you want to get emotional about. And it's like what everybody else said. It is something that needs to be resourced, studied, taken seriously. And we don't want to believe everything you hear, and yet you need to do all the research. So I really don't have much to add to that, but I do appreciate the opportunity to have a voice here at this forum. I want to honor Stephen Greer for the great work that he did, and Captain Ron. This platform is amazing, and it's just been a really awesome experience to just see this platform and present with everybody here today. And I know the rest of the conference is going to be great, especially if Danny's coming up. Woo!
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Thanks all of you for sharing.
Thank you.
We really enjoyed it. We're going to need to stop now for lunch. Bathrooms are located on the second floor. I don't know why avatars need bathrooms, but that's where they are. Thanks so much. We're going to be back right at 1:30 for Mr. Daniel Sheehan.
Thank you, Ron.
All right.
Thank you for everything. Thank
See you a
you.
little bit later.
Yeah.
Guys.
Part of it.